part of our goal for this course is to learn about how we actually study and do biology. In other words, how do we learn about biology and answer questions about the living world? Well, we do this by keeping that in mind that biology is a science. And science is basically a process of inquiry and observation. So being curious about something, observing the natural world around you, and wanting to describe why or how something happens. So we can break science up into discovery science and also hypothesis-based science. And so we're going to talk about the difference between the two and why we want to use hypothesis-based science in our studies of biology. So biology is a scientific discipline, and science is basically observing the world around you. Now, science covers a huge array of categories, including chemistry and physics and earth science, astronomy, and all of those types of things, many other things. But what's important about science is that it's a process of making an observation or identifying something that's interesting and then asking a question about it and investigating in order to answer your question. In order to do that investigation, we are going to use the scientific method. The scientific method is a set of procedures that help us observe the world in an unbiased fashion based on data. So the scientific method can be a little bit fluid. You may get to a point where you start to test something and you just stop and rework your question or your hypothesis. But our goal is always to answer questions, to propose an explanation for those questions, and then test to see if that explanation is supported by real data and real observations. So there are two ways that you can, air quotes, do science. We're going to focus on biology and biology-related questions. But the first one is discovery science. Now, discovery science is super important. It's how we learn facts about the world around us. Discovery science asks descriptive questions. So it's basically a fact-finding way to learn about the living world. So I like to call these the who, what, when, and where questions. You are simply collecting data without any sort of question or without looking for an explanation as to why these things are the way they are. It's simply to gather information and make observations. Now, without discovery-based science, we have a really hard time doing hypothesis-based science because you need to know some information about the world around you to really study it and really learn about it. And so the first step in learning about biology is often just looking for the what. What is happening around you? What do you find interesting? Things like that. So an example of this might be testing a large number of drugs to look for activity against disease. This is super important if you're trying to find a cure for something, if you're trying to look for anything new and novel that might be helpful. Now, that doesn't mean that you at this point have to understand why or how they're working. You're just looking for what is working. Another example might be sequencing genomes. So determining the initial sequence of DNA or a protein is going to be the first step in allowing you to study it more deeply and really understand it. Now, discovery-based science is important because it usually leads to observations and questions that can be tested using the scientific method and tested using hypotheses. So when you are thinking about whether something is discovery-based or hypothesis testing, you're really trying to distinguish between if you are looking for facts, in which case you've got discovery-based science, or if you are looking for an explanation. And when you get to the point of an explanation, you've now come into hypothesis testing and inquiry-based science. So hypothesis testing and inquiry-based science tries to answer causal questions. In other words, questions that offer an explanation for a phenomenon. You are looking for an explanation for why something happens. It may also be an explanation for how something happens. But if you're looking at how, you really want to make sure that you're looking for the causal reason that something happens, not for a fact-based reason. But we're really looking to find an explanation for whatever happens to be interesting to us. So the scientific method really starts when you observe something that piques your interest and you want to find an explanation for why that particular thing is happening. So then you're going to ask your causal question and try to explain your phenomenon. So for example, if we go back to this testing large numbers of drugs to look for activity against the disease, we might ask why a specific substance works. Or we might ask how that substance works. Now, this is different from whether or not it works. And so if you want to figure out why or how it works, you're going to design an experiment to answer those questions. So as we move through this course and as we do our labs and go through some of our topics here, we're going to come back to these causal questions. We're going to come back to how we use those questions to form a hypothesis, and then we're going to get into how we test those hypotheses. So a hypothesis is always going to be an answer to our question or our observation. A hypothesis is going to be a possible explanation to sort of provide some background information and a reason for your question. Now, the important thing about a hypothesis is that it really needs to be based on previous observations, previous knowledge, based on that discovery-based science. And so you're not going to write a hypothesis when you know nothing about the system, when you know nothing about what you're looking at. Because a hypothesis is supposed to be an educated explanation to your question. So we're not just guessing at an answer. We're going to use the things we already know. We're going to use preliminary observations, and we are going to make a plausible, educated explanation for our hypothesis. So a hypothesis is not a guess. Students will often learn in lower grades that a hypothesis is an educated guess. And the term educated in there is just fine. For me, a guess is not fine. Calling it an educated guess implies that you don't really know anything about what you are trying to answer. And so I always tell my students that when we make observations, for example, in our labs, you are going to use those observations to help you formulate your hypothesis. And I will often tell students that I expect them to make a logical hypothesis based on those preliminary observations or their preliminary learning from the lab. I don't want my students to just say, oh, well, this activity is going to go up or it's going to go down, with no understanding of the concepts that we're trying to cover. And so for the purposes of this course, I might say, nope, your hypothesis is wrong, with air quotes, meaning that I don't think you're using the information that you have to make a reasonable hypothesis. And so I really want you evaluating your observations, evaluating what you are seeing in the experiments that we are doing, and using those to make your educated explanation. Now, another thing about a hypothesis is that a hypothesis is supposed to make a prediction. Now, in a few minutes, we will talk about how we actually make predictions. It'll probably be in the next video. But a prediction is a specific statement of the data that you are going to need to support your hypothesis. So what that means is that your hypothesis must be testable. In other words, you have to be able to design an experiment for which you can gather data that evaluates your hypothesis. And so, along with your hypothesis, you want to be able to make a prediction about the data you expect for a supported hypothesis. So as you make your hypothesis, you want to base it on the observations that you have, and you want to think about what sort of data you might need to collect in order to support that hypothesis. Because you have to be able to design a test that is actually going to give you data that is going to tell you whether or not your hypothesis has been supported by your evidence. Because a key purpose of science is using data to support your claims and your observations. If you cannot collect data, you cannot answer your question, you cannot support or disprove your hypothesis. So again, a hypothesis is a plausible explanation. You will use the data from your experiments to either support or reject a hypothesis. It is really important that you recognize that a hypothesis is never proven. You can support it, but you cannot test every single instance in which that hypothesis might apply. And so without being able to test every possibility, we can't prove that that hypothesis is correct. We can say that we have supported that hypothesis in our particular instance. And so when my students in their lab, is usually where this happens, they will say, I have proven my hypothesis. And I will respond and possibly take off points and say, no, you have not. You did one little tiny experiment asking one little tiny question. And you may have supported it, and your neighbor may have supported it, but you have not proven that that hypothesis holds true in every situation. So a couple things to keep in mind. We don't prove our hypotheses, but we do support or reject a hypothesis. Now, a rejected hypothesis is just as important as a supported one, because a rejected hypothesis, when your data does not support your potential answer to your question, it means that either you didn't design the right experiment, or that your hypothesis may not be the answer to the question. And so you are not wrong if you don't support your hypothesis. And what I will ask you to do in this class is to evaluate your hypothesis based on your data. And so I'm not taking off points if you don't support your hypothesis. I'm only taking off points if your hypothesis doesn't match your observations and the material that we have presented in the class, or if you have not evaluated your data based on our class criteria. So if you haven't done our calculations correctly, or you are using incorrect concepts to draw your conclusions, then I might take off some points. But a rejected hypothesis is just as valid. And you can use that rejected hypothesis to refine your experiment, to rework your question, to rework your hypothesis, and go back and continue to work at and chip away at the answer to your question. So a hypothesis has a couple of requirements. One of them is that they must be testable. In other words, you have to be able to design an experiment. And so this has to be something that you can actually test with the equipment and the capabilities that you currently have. If there is no machine on earth that is going to test what you want to test, well, then it's just not testable and you can't do that. So you have to be able to actually design an experiment and test the specific hypothesis that you want. Now, some questions are not testable. These are faith-based questions and supernatural questions. We can't answer those questions because we can't measure. We cannot design an experiment to answer faith-based questions. We cannot design an experiment to answer supernatural questions because those are not part of the natural world. It doesn't mean that those questions are not valid. It doesn't mean that those questions are not important, but our hypothesis-based testing that should be based on measurable data is not going to answer those questions. And so we have to find different methods to answer those faith-based and supernatural questions. Again, you also have to be able to design an experiment with your resources, with your knowledge. And if you can't, well, then you need to redesign your hypothesis. So some questions can't be answered based on what technology we have available or what question we are happening to answer. So here's an example hypothesis for the question, why do maple trees drop their leaves? So before we even look at the hypothesis, you probably already have some idea of why maple trees drop their leaves. Well, they drop their leaves because it's fall. You probably already know that. You may not really know why they drop their leaves in the fall, but that is the point of this question. So if we think about things that happen in the fall, our days get shorter. So a plausible hypothesis might be maple leaves drop their leaves in autumn because of shortened hours of sunlight. So what you're doing here is you're taking information you know. You've observed that they drop their leaves in the autumn, and you're also observing that autumn has shorter days. Maybe there's a correlation here. And so you can design an experiment to determine whether or not trees drop their leaves because of shorter hours in the day. Related to a hypothesis is a theory. A theory is a broad explanation backed by extensive evidence. Now, I want to draw your attention to this extensive evidence note. One problem and misconception that I hear all the time in my intro biology courses is that a theory is just a guess. And the reason that we think that is because when we use it in our everyday speech, you'll say something like, I have a theory about that. And it's just kind of your guess as to why something has happened. Maybe it's based on past experience, which is great. Maybe it's something you just thought of on the fly. But in our everyday language, a theory is something that doesn't have a lot of credibility. In science, a theory is the closest thing that we have to a truth. A theory is an explanation that has been supported by a large body of evidence. In other words, there are many hypotheses related to that theory that have been supported. And when you continue to support these hypotheses in many, many different situations, you start to see that there's a common theme. And when you get so much evidence that you're not finding a reason to reject your hypothesis, then it becomes a theory. And so a theory is, again, the closest thing that we can get to a truth in science. So some examples are Darwin's theory of evolution. Very often when we get to our evolution section, I hear students say, well, evolution is just a theory. Oh, yes, it is. It's a scientific theory that has been supported by a large body of evidence. It's been observed. It's been documented. And so it's not just something that some old guy named Charles Darwin proposed and people think might happen. It's something that we continually, as biologists, see over and over and over again. Another one is the cell theory. We'll get to that in chapter 4. The theory of gravity is another theory. I don't think any of you are going to dispute the theory of gravity because every time you drop something, it hits the floor. The moon orbits around the earth because of gravity. You stay planted firmly on the ground. Even if you jump, you come back down because of gravity. So when I ask students to think about a theory, I always pull them back to the theory of gravity. You test it over and over and over again, and every time it holds true. So keep that one in mind when you are tempted to say, oh, it's just a theory, because a theory in science is backed by extensive evidence and has so far not been rejected. However, for both theories and hypotheses, keep in mind that they can be falsified, meaning that you can reject them. There might be a situation we haven't encountered yet where that theory or that hypothesis is not supported. And when we observe that, we might have to rethink our theory. Again, just like a hypothesis, a theory is never proven true. It is supported. It's been supported a lot. But even though I said it's the closest thing we have to a truth, we're still not going to call a theory or a hypothesis proven or true. Again, because we can't prove it in every situation. However, because we keep supporting these theories over and over again, they are considered to be very likely to be true. And so that's why I say that we sort of think of them as a biological or scientific truth. So a theory is going to be consistent with a vast amount of data. So these theories have been supported over and over and over again by different related experiments. And our theories are going to allow us to make predictions and to continue to test them. So even though we're thinking of a theory as synonymous with true, we can still continue to test them. We can still continue to try to support hypotheses that are related to those theories.